Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for this State Department of Education. I'm happy to join with one of my dear friends, a long time back in the work. So everybody in Maine, I don't want you to feel like I forget about you if anything's ever changed. If you're one of my teacher leader friends, you are always one of my teacher leader friends. Joining us today is Abby Swetz. She was one of my teacher leaders back in Madison when we were redoing our middle school curriculum. She was an amazing 8th grade US history teacher who I was sad to see leave the classroom, but she had an opportunity she couldn't pass up. She made was able to join the La Follette School of Public Policy at the University of Wisconsin. If you're familiar with the La Follette School of Public Policy at UW, it's a pretty big deal to get accepted. And so it was a very sad but sweet moment to see that Abby had to leave the classroom, but she's continued to do good work. She loves political science, and it is really a strength of hers teaching politics. So I've invited her here today to talk about, so you want to be president, how to teach about the election during contentious times. And without any further ado, I will turn it over to Abby Swetz.
Wonderful. So hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I just want to give you the background that the unit I'm about to launch into was taught after teaching the bare bones of the Constitution in terms of the 3 branches of government. And the unit I'm about to talk you through, and at the end of this, give you the resources to teach if you want to replicate it in your own classroom, took almost the entirety of October. So I taught 8th grade history and English. I was lucky enough to do that for about 7 years. And before that, I was a special ed assistant. And when I was teaching 8th grade English and history, I was really, really lucky to be able to teach them in combo, which I know is not a common experience. I will say that I have never taught a canned lesson in my life. I always home canned everything I made. And this is like fellow teacher home canned, but it will be canned. It was created for my classroom and not yours. And so I want you to know that I encourage you and frankly expect you to make changes to these lessons if you decide to use them in your classroom, because you know your students better than anyone else, and you know what will work for them and what won't, and how to be best responsive to them. So please keep in mind that this is still canned, but by me, and I hope you take it and make it your own if you decide to do that. So I'm going to share my screen now. You'll notice that I am not a professional PowerPoint maker because I hate them. I think they're rather boring modes of communication, but I also think that they are effective ways of getting across images and big ideas. So you'll notice that my PowerPoint does not have a lot of detail. At the end of this PowerPoint, you will receive a link to a Google folder with every document I talk about in here, all the lesson plans, as well as all the student materials. They were made for the 2016 election, so please keep that in mind. Okay, so I want to start with just some big picture ideas. I personally believe that voting is the bedrock of a democracy, and that safety is the bedrock of a classroom. And I'm going to share it in this mode because I can't see anything otherwise. Hold on one second. Let me make this better. Joe, can you confirm you can still see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Beautiful. That's all I needed. So I want to start by talking for a second about the contentious times in this title of this workshop. I think I created that title long before the current protests happening, and to say that things are challenging times right now, or even a little trite, but I would say that this is a time of challenge, and it is a time to challenge. And so when I talk about safety being the bedrock of the classroom, I'm not saying that we weren't talking about difficult issues. I'm saying that we were safe enough to challenge ourselves and others in the ideas that we were sharing. So I said as an English teacher that I wanted my students to grow up to be critical consumers of information, and as a history teacher, I wanted them to grow up and vote. And I think that those are two incredibly important and intersecting ideas. And I also always believed that my most important job as a teacher was for my students to be safe. And I think that those things cannot happen without each other.
which is why the first thing that I always talk about in my classroom, and specifically in an election unit, is the idea of civic engagement being a part of the responsibility of a citizen, and also the part of a responsibility of a student to keep the conversation safe. So you'll notice, because I'm about to share it in front of me, that on the bottom right here of each of these slides, there is a number and a title. The number and title correspond to the lesson in the Google folder that you're going to get shared with you. So this was, for example, lesson number 5. And I'll talk through what that looked like in my classroom. So I always started the school year with a social contract on the first day of school that the students wrote themselves. I believed that we needed an even stronger one and more specific one when we talk about an election. And so we created our own election civic engagement contract. It was based on a lesson from Teaching Tolerance, which I am sure you all know already, thanks to Joe. And if you don't, oh my gosh, Joe, you're not doing this well. So Teaching Tolerance has a lesson about creating a civility contract, and I changed it into a civic engagement contract by having my students read the Teaching Tolerance civility contract and then digest it through the lens of our social contract we had already created. And then we rewrote it and signed it, and then kept it posted in the room and revisited it whenever we needed to. When we talk about the importance of voting, this is where the content of the unit really started, because I don't think you can talk about elections without grounding them in what we as people who live in the United States have to do in an election. And I think that we need to keep in mind that obviously the students that we're teaching cannot vote because of their age, and possibly will not be able to vote because of citizenship. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind that this critical consumption of information is also something you do during an election, and it is part of your sort of civic responsibility. So I started with lessons on the importance of voting, specifically with the essential questions of why do we vote, and why is voting a civic responsibility? Why is being actively involved in your democracy a civic responsibility? And so we looked at that through the lens of history, by looking at the fight for women's suffrage and the fight for African-American suffrage. There is a very well done Reader's Theater play from the National Archives. Who knew the National Archives were playwrights? And they created a Reader's Theater play that I used in my classroom. We did it as a play, sort of in a circle, sharing it with each other, and really looked at who in the play made the most convincing arguments and why, and all of the suffragettes were in the play, as well as people who were very much arguing against that at the time. And so we really looked.
Can anybody else hear Abby? Am I on my own? Nope, okay.
Retract suffrage includes a copy of a Louisiana literacy test from I want to say it's 1940s. It's in the document. I'd use that as an activity in different ways when I was teaching elections in different years. One time we went through, and every time students found a question they thought was confusing, they circled it, and then of course they circle every question. Another time I just set it up as a fun activity to let's all take a fun quiz together, and then timed it to be the same amount of time people were given at the polls, without any explanation that that's what it was. It's an incredibly frustrating quiz because of course there are no right answers, because that way anyone can be told they are wrong. And so then when it was revealed what it was, it always created a really great, rich, and very emotional discussion. I often used the Selma Bridge to the Ballot documentary in this part from Teaching Tolerance, and then we went into a discussion of voter ID laws. There are links in the lesson plans that I'm going to share with you about how to best use evidence to talk about voter ID laws. I want to just mention the primaries, just because someday you will teach the 2024 election, and obviously wouldn't be teaching the primaries for the 2020 election. But for future reference, I had never thought of teaching the primaries until 2015, and then my students specifically asked because they were very confused by the process, and they were very confused by what the candidates were saying because it seemed to be rather divisive. And so I decided to sort of create a new lesson. So this was actually the year before with a different group of kids, but we created a student developed project where every kid took a different candidate because there were so many people running that they could all take a single candidate, and they were allowed to use the campaign website and the candidate's own words from their actual speeches to craft answers to questions, and then we did a debate. It was possibly the most on-topic debate I've ever seen in politics, and it was moderated by me as the teacher. This is just a little funny clip of me introducing it as if I am Rachel Maddow. Okay, back to the general election process unit that I was teaching during the presidential election. So once we talk about the importance of voting, then you really have to talk about, like, how does that vote get counted? Because it is a very not intuitive process, as you know. And so I created a couple of lessons about how the Electoral College was created, how the Electoral College affects, how the Electoral College differs from the popular vote, and what it looks like when people start talking about polling and speculation and what is a swing state. And I created those lessons based on looking at past Electoral College results and really diving into how the different states have differing results based on what time period in American history they happened in. Also, it's a fun coloring activity. Students love that. You will run out of blue and red markers and crayons. This is a good time to pause for a second and talk about something I didn't do a lot of in 2016. And that is that I did not do a lot in terms of actual explicit lessons about fact checking and misinformation. If I were going to teach this lesson in 2020, I would have explicit lessons in how to fact check something and how to look at evidence and what are credible sources. I did it, I interspersed it, but if I were going to do this again and do it better, I would make some very explicit recommendations when it comes to that. And that is why on this slide, in the comments section, you'll find some links to different fact check websites and some advice on some ways that I taught my students how to use search terms to do effective fact checking. That is because the next thing we're going to talk about is what conventions and candidates look like. So I talked about essential questions for a moment earlier when we were talking about suffrage. Most of the lesson plans that I'm going to share with you are a little rough, sorry, Joe, because they were being used real time in 2016. And so they were being used by a team of teachers. We all really created them together. And we used learning targets as opposed to like very long justifications for each lesson because we were needing them to get out quick. So the learning targets for the conventions and candidates are, I can examine the Republican or Democratic candidate for president so I can better understand the presidential election and its significance. The learning targets always have that I can statement, and then at the end they always have the so I can or so that, and that always tied into the election and its significance so that people understood that elections really do have consequences. So for the conventions and the candidates, you'll have separate, I taught it in separate, on separate days when it came to the different candidates for the different parties. The idea behind the lessons about the candidates was that we would take a look at the candidates in the way their party would like us to see them, as in looking at them through the way they were launched during the convention, which of course was over the summer, so the students hadn't necessarily seen it. And then the students would sift that information that they were sort of being sold through their own critical thinking process and look at what are the evidence behind, if the reasoning of the party is you should vote for my candidate, what evidence are they providing, and does that match my own personal reasoning, and does that fit with our civic engagement contract that we created earlier in the year? So they sort of listed positive and negative charts, pros and cons for the candidates as they listen to their speeches or as they watch their launch videos. I'll pause here and say it is a very difficult thing to teach when the candidates and when society is in a pretty divisive space, and also, frankly, when one of the candidates uses such incredibly problematic language in speeches. We'll talk about that more if you have questions at the end. I will say that that is why we created such a strong election social contract, because my students actually, of their own accord, started taking that civic engagement contract and applying it to the candidates themselves, which I had not seen as something that we needed to do, and they saw as something we needed to do. And so we would often look at speeches or in a moment, advertisements through the lens of the civic contract itself and how well each candidate was really following what my students thought needed to be followed. This is my favorite one, party platforms. Okay, so I seriously doubt anyone on this call has ever read the entire platform from either party or both parties. And I can say I honestly have for 2016 and for 2012. And it was fascinating because there is so much there you don't even realize is there. And also because it's just a wealth of information when it comes to who are these parties, what are their beliefs, what do they see as a future that they want, and what do they believe in terms of the level of involvement the government should have in everyday lives. And I think those are questions that people in general and students in specific can really learn a lot from. And so we looked at the process of how is a party platform created. We analyzed the preface of each platform because we were really able to look at the vision of the party from there. And then the really fun part is that I divided up the individual planks by issue, and then students in small groups would take through and read the planks read planks on the same issue from both parties and analyze the evidence that was and reasoning that was used in each of these party platforms for that same issue, and then really try and synthesize how those different planks were in conversation or in argument with each other, and how each of them really came back to the vision of the parties. And that served to be some of the most passionate conversations I've ever heard in my classroom. And they were still incredibly respectful, but they were very indicative of that adage of the personal is political and the political is personal, because when you're 13 and 14, A, everything is personal, and B, these things really have an effect on your life once you realize what they are, and you don't yet have a vote. And so they really were very engaged with understanding better the parties. Then we analyzed political ads, which was fascinating. You'll notice in this presentation of what the unit looked like in 2016, I didn't use a lot of earned media, didn't use a lot of clips from like CNN. That is a very difficult needle to thread. And I'll say it's partly because the conversation about media is incredibly partisan, and also partly because I find the media to sometimes create a false equivalency where there isn't one, or sort of have a both sidesism where there isn't one. So I decided to teach students to critically examine the direct source, meaning the candidates and the platforms themselves, so that they could sift that information through their own lens of what they truly felt was important to value and their civic engagement contract, as opposed to sort of having the secondary source of media. Feel free to create some fabulous lessons of your own on that, but I don't have any to give you today. So political ads, the learning target was I can explain the function of a character ad, an issue ad, and a negative ad so that I can better understand the presidential election process and its significance. And so this was a fascinating day because we took all these different ads, which thanks to YouTube, which was less of a thing earlier, and so I didn't have as strong a lesson in this in previous elections. We divided up our sheets of paper with just columns of character, issue, and negative or attack ads. And whenever we watched an ad, we were trying to figure out where do they fit in this categorization and what was effective or ineffective about them. So for example, if an ad was a character ad entirely focused on what are the past accomplishments of a candidate, what was effective about those past accomplishments, who was this targeted audience for. And the thing that I found most interesting is when we were talking about effective and ineffective, this is where the students really brought out the civic contract, not for themselves, but they started to, well, also that, but they started really applying it to the candidates. And I found a lot of strength in their argument when they were talking about how they found negative and attack ads incredibly effective, because they felt like they were breaking the civic engagement contract that they themselves had decided was important. And I thought that was a really interesting insight that they had. And then when it comes to political ads and understanding how you are sold information, I thought a good exercise would be to learn by doing. So they were put in small groups. Everybody didn't issue ad because they didn't want to deal with the potential of negative attack ads. Everybody didn't issue ad, but you were told to be pro that issue or anti that issue. And then since you already had studied the platforms, the planks, and how those issues intersected, they had a lot of vocabulary to use, because they were in those same small groups, and they were able to really investigate the issue itself, and create their own little mini ad, which were also hilarious. So a very good activity for collaborative learning and team building pretty early on in the year, I would say, as well. That, of course, depends on the technology you have available to you. That was a stretch in my school in 2016 in terms of getting the ability to record those, but we made it through. So that's the main meat of the unit. And then I'll say, obviously, it ends in election night. I'll pause here to say that I did not assign watching debates. I think it's inequitable to assign watching television, especially something that lasts that long in an evening. Not everybody has that time. Not everybody has access to the television. After the last debate, with tally marks. Yeah.
We lost you for about 10 or 15 seconds. The last thing we heard was, I don't assign the watching the debate.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I don't assign the debates because I think assigning a television show and B, something that lasts that long is potentially an equity concern. But I will say that I had students elect to watch the debates, and I had students elect to watch them through the lens of the social contract that we had created, that civic engagement contract. And I actually had students come back with the contract in hand and little tally marks on where each of the candidates had either broken it or lived up to its requirements, which I thought was sort of wonderful and warmed my little heart. I will say that I did provide you a potential sub-unit, a sub-lesson plan for yourselves, in case you have to be sick during the election unit, or in case you just need a day that involves a video. And it is, I created an activity that was really easy to do based on the debate that was the debate episode from the West Wing way back when. And so it's just an interesting little fun activity in case you need something in your back pocket, because I have learned through hard experience that sometimes you need more things in your back pocket than you realized. So anyway, with the election sheet, I provided you a tracking sheet in case you want students to be trying to watch the results of the election. Again, I didn't require that because of equity concerns, but they had it if they wanted to, and that was fun for a lot of them, and then also depends on what you want the outcome to be, potentially not fun for a lot of them. This is a picture of my classroom. You'll see it is incredibly messy, and this is what it looked like on the last day of school, because we circled up to thank each other for each other's friendship, but it's also what it looked like the day after the election. Processing the election is a difficult thing to do, because depending on the makeup of the political ideas of your student classroom, some people are going to be really excited and some people are going to be really sad, and more than a few people will be angry, and that's a tough thing to navigate. I will say that this is why you create a civic engagement contract at the beginning of the unit, at the beginning of the year, frankly. I reminded my students of the civic engagement contract, and I opened up the floor for questions. Make sure you're ready for some emotions, and possibly even more importantly, make sure you're ready for students to not be ready. And that is why very shortly after opening up the floor for questions, I realized that students didn't have questions as much as they wanted to just have a moment to react, but they didn't all feel comfortable doing it publicly, which I completely understand. And I didn't think they needed to do it publicly. They needed to do it for themselves. And so I created some writing options, writing prompts for my students to process the election through their own personal lenses on the day after the election. And that proved incredibly valuable for them. It was one of those incredibly meaningful days that you teach. Because, you know, we need to keep in mind that this is so personal and they don't have a say yet. And that is possibly incredibly frustrating. So that is what I'll end with, and then I'll take it for questions. Oh, wait, nope, never mind. I want to show you what the end of this presentation looks like. This is the last slide that you will get. Obviously, this PowerPoint is not a PowerPoint you need to reference a whole lot because I just had images and talked a lot, but this is my email. I will admit that I have an incredibly busy job right now because I work in the health department and there is a pandemic, in case y'all didn't know. So I will promise to not be able to respond right away to questions, but if you have them, please send them to me and I will get back to you as soon as I can because I love teaching and I miss it a whole lot and I would love to answer questions. I do have a website because I wrote a one-woman show about teaching a few years ago and took it to a theater off-Broadway in New York, and so I needed a marketing website. But the reason I mention it is that there are other unit plans on this website in case you were interested in looking specifically at how to teach argumentative writing. And then the slideshow will be sent to you specifically for this link at the bottom. This is a Google Drive Google Drive folder that has the lessons, the specific learning targets, the activities for each of throughout the day, sort of like your to-do list, your order of operations. And then if there are any student materials that you're going to need for that lesson, I am providing that for you as well. So I'll add right now, because I bet Joe's not going to love the look of some of those documents, that they are incredibly practical and not always really strong on the theory behind them, other than I can tell you that they worked really well in the classroom. I did not go through and like list the academic references for each of those in the lesson plan. I was moving fast when I made them, and I did go back and try and clean them up a little bit for you all, but they are the kind of lesson plans you have on a daily basis versus the kind you make for your supervisor who visits you during your student teaching. So my apologies for not making them potentially stronger, but I thought by being able to explain the unit a little bit to you all, you would have enough of a jumping off point to really use them if you want to. So I'll just end with a reminder before we go through with any questions that these are still canned, and for you to be able to use them effectively in your own classroom, you're going to need to recan them a little bit to be able to really use them strongly. Okay, I think that's everything I needed to say. Sorry, that was probably too fast. I talk really, really fast. But at least you didn't have to deal with my handwriting like the students used to. Okay, Joe, passing it over.
Oh, still your show. I'm just here to thank you again for sharing all of that. There was not any questions during the thing there was not any questions in the chat box during the presentation. So I will give everybody a moment to think about if they have any questions for you. I'm going to go ahead and make it so that you guys can unmute yourself. to ask in real time. I did note in the chat box, Abby, you had talked about some of the places where you didn't address like media and bias and some of those type of stuff. And I wanted everybody to know next Wednesday at noon, we have Dr. Wayne Journell, who's the author of Unpacking Fake News with educators and students. He's coming to speak. And then next Thursday, the News Literacy Project, they've made all of their stuff free, and they are going to come at, I think it's 12:30 next Thursday for 90 minutes. They're gonna walk you through all their resources, talk about the SIF, Checkology, and stuff like that. So you can have some of those tools at your disposal. There is a question.
Amazing. Can I just say that that is amazing?
Send you the links. Do you want to join us, or are you going to still be too busy with work?
There is no way.
So Abby, Pauline wants to know, how do you manage your own bias and tone of voice? Not easy this election.
Fabulous question. So I'm going to go back to safety for a second. So I think it's incredibly important that a classroom be safe for students, but I also think it's incredibly important for a classroom to be safe for teachers. And I have never told my students who I voted for, and I never would. I wouldn't tell you either. But I will say that I believe that bullying is wrong and that you cannot be a bystander to it. And so if there is a presidential candidate who is engaging in bullying behavior, I called that person out on that. And my students did too. And I don't think that's bias. I think that's just teacher being safe. That is also why I didn't use earned media as much. So like when it comes to CNN, NBC, Fox, MSNBC, I think it would be, I have trouble figuring out how to do that without privileging certain voices more than others when it comes to which media to use. Mostly because I think there's I said this before, but like there's a little bit of a false equivalency in terms of who is represented by those media. And that is why I tried to really stick to what the party is saying about itself and what the candidate is saying about themselves. But then also use a very critical eye about that. So never buying anything hook, line, and sinker as much as saying, this is what they're saying. How does this make you feel? How do you feel it deals with what their party is saying their values are? And is that something that you potentially connect to? I realized I forgot to say something because it's a lesson in the folder. And I was going to talk about it on election night. I did end the unit by students writing a position paper advocating for a certain candidate. Not a position paper on who I would vote for, because that is not the kind of question that I think a student ever would need to answer, even in their life after they turn 18, because that's a private decision in this country. But deciding on how would you advocate for a candidate if you were, for example, like a campaign manager or something like that. And I had many students specifically tell me they chose to advocate for a candidate they actually didn't agree with because they thought it would be a good, a challenging writing exercise, which is adorable. But because I taught English and history, and because this unit takes a lot of time, I needed to make it an English assessment as well. And that's why I did that opinion paper. And so I did add those lessons and like that template into the Google folder. I didn't mention it in this presentation because it's not really as much a history thing as it is an English thing, but it could be a history thing. And so I did provide those resources for you as well, in case you're wondering what those are when you look in the Google Drive and don't see something I didn't mention.
Abby,
Guiding questions. I see that question. Is that, Joe, is that another question?
I'm going to have one thing for you, Abby. I'm wondering if you've been frozen for just a little bit, but we got broken audio. I think we heard you. This isn't the best viewing opportunity, but I'm wondering if you just hit your video, and we'll just go with the audio, if that's helpful with your bandwidth. And then I didn't hear, did you say that you saw the questions?
I saw a question about what are the guiding questions for the unit?
Yep.
Am I right? That's the next one?
Yep.
Okay. So great question. It's in the Google Doc, I promise. But I mentioned it during, I think, the voting suffrage history part in terms of why is voting important and what is your role in a democracy. I think those are incredibly important, and those were really the guiding questions for the entire unit, because I think being critical consumers of information is part of your role in a democracy. Thank you so much for asking that as a clarifying one. I was not clear enough about that.
Do you see the question about sixth graders, appropriate for sixth graders to modify?
Oh, sixth graders are the best. Great question. I'm so glad you said you will, of course, modify, because that is, of course, what I was about to say. I will say that I think especially as you get younger and younger, you need to be incredibly careful when it comes to the ads lesson. I would potentially not do it, or not talk about negative ads. That's where it can get a little dicey. I will say that the party platforms are written at a reading level that would be not as accessible as I would like it to be for sixth grade. That doesn't mean that some of them won't work. I think you could still do the preface activity, which is really good because it gives them a good idea of what the overall vision of each party is. But I think the individual platform planks are written at too high a level to make them very accessible to sixth graders. So that's a great question.
Pauline's clarifying what activity part?
Oh, good question. So during the platform, thank you. In the platform realm, sorry, let me back up. I hear a lot of things outside my door. The activity is students in small groups. They have essentially a response sheet that they need to use to analyze different planks of the party platforms. Planks of each platform, the planks match. So like if your topic is Second Amendment, you would have a plank from the Republican platform and you would have a plank from the Democratic platform, and you work through a response sheet in the small group to try and dig in to see how they are in conversation with each other or how they very much disagree with each other. I think that would be a little inaccessible to sixth graders just because of how difficult the planks are to read. I'm sorry, a plank, if that's the question, a plank of a platform is the specific issue of that platform. Looking for more information on civility kind of. Yes, it is. So in terms of the civility contract from tolerance.org, I am sure there will be more lessons about this from Teaching Tolerance before 2020 school year starts. In 2016, right before the school year started, they released some sort of guidance. It wasn't so much lessons as it was like literally a beautifully designed document that laid out rules of the road for talking about the election in your classroom. And the idea was just that you would talk through it and have students sign it. Because I don't love canned things, I made it my own by having students read it and then combine it with our own already written social contract for the classroom. And so then they signed that. I'm sure there will be updated lessons for the 2020 election from tolerance.org. But in the meantime, there is a link that is in the information that you are going to have at the end of all of this that will lead you to the 2016 one. Oh yeah, no worries. Nobody's read a platform, are you kidding? That's why it's so fun to make 14-year-olds read them.
Other question, oh, I'm seeing more questions. It says, do you share the first contract writing activity?
Great question. If I can find it, it will be yours. Good question. Let me write down that I need to locate that. I think I wrote it up for when I was working with student teachers at UW. So I should be able to locate that.
And then would that just be added to that Google folder?
I'll just put it in the Google folder for sure.
Perfect, thank you. Other questions for Abby? I'm dropping your link to the feedback survey and contact our form. Other questions for Abby? Chat box.
You just froze, Joe, so I don't know if that means that there's no questions or if you were frozen.
I may have been frozen.
Okay.
Nicole asked, would you ask students to identify when a politician breaks with the platform?
That's a good question. I never asked that, but they brought it up in their own conversation. Let me. I guess, no, I didn't ask any students to sort of like publicly in the whole class discussion identify that, or like sort of point fingers, for lack of a better term. I did ask them to, when I talked about using it in the classroom, it was to guide our own discussions. I used to say that people's ideas are up for debate, but not their identities. And I think that was a good guiding principle. But I would say that students were encouraged to use their observations of the candidates through the election civic engagement contract to inform their own opinions about the candidates, and that could inform their position papers that they wrote at the end of the unit, which of course was only read by me and not by everyone.
How or would you, sound like Elaine's asking, you made some notes about what you might do a little bit differently this time around, but the question is, would you adjust this unit given the difficult nature of this election season?
I don't know how to answer that because it's not September yet. I can't imagine that there's just going to be a lot of difference between today and November. And I wish I had a better answer for this. The answer is yes, I would change it, but I don't know how yet. I changed it a little bit before I handed it to you. 2016 was a pretty difficult nature of an election season as well. So I think I have two almost completely different units that I've used in elections, and one was in 2012 and one was in 2016, and there were definite overlaps, but 2016 was a very different election, and so I taught it differently. So I'm sure 2020 will be a different election, and this is an incredibly unsatisfactory answer for you, but the answer is yes, I would change it, but I don't know how yet, other than adding in some fact checking and misinformation stuff, which I'm so glad you're going to have a seminar on. I wish I could be there. Voter suppression, yes, I did. We talked about voter suppression when we were talking about, at the beginning, when I was setting up the importance of voting and talking about women's suffrage and African-American suffrage. We talked about voter suppression in those days as part of the fight for actual one person, one vote. And there's a pretty good timeline that's linked into the documents about that lesson. That takes you through how different types of voter suppression still exist today. That's a great question. Mail-in ballots. We talked about how they existed, but no, we didn't talk a lot about mail-in ballots in 2016. We talked about how, there's the day of voting. There is, depending on which state you're in Wisconsin, there's quite a bit of early voting available. And of course, also mail-in ballots. I think it's going to come up a lot more this year, though. So I would highly suggest talking about it, but I don't have a lesson on it. How about now? I'm sorry, Karen, I don't know what that's in reference to.
And you guys do have the ability to unmute if it's easy.
There I go. It was a follow-up to the question that I asked about voter suppression, because there seems to be a lot of voter suppression going on now, as opposed to a long time ago, and more than people really probably even cared to know about.
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. And actually, like if I was teaching 2020, I would do it more. But yes, in terms of like now being 2016, because that's when I taught it at the time, we talked quite a bit about voter suppression in the form of voter ID, and also in the form of cutting down hours for early voting. And that's in the timeline that's given in that lesson. I would say specifically because I live in Wisconsin, there would be quite a lot to talk about in terms of voter suppression, specifically about mail-in ballots and the pandemic, if I were going to teach this in 2020.
Hi, I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
I had fun making campaign ads when my students had iPads.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm at a school where all the students have Chromebooks, and I haven't been able to find kind of a satisfactory way for them to recreate them with the Chromebook technology. So I just didn't know if you happen to know of anything that would work on that device.
That's a great question. No, because we had iPads and not Chromebooks, but I would say this, and that is that, and I'm sure you've all seen this because we are living through COVID right now, but you know how a lot of candidates, well, like anyone, and especially celebrities, are doing a lot of talk straight to the phone videos right now, especially since like people are campaigning from their basements. I think you could alter the lesson to be, instead of like full-blown beautiful campaign ads, to be like candidate testimonials, and you could do the same thing in terms of issue ads for that. And that I know you can do on a Chromebook because the camera is right in front of you and you can just talk straight to the camera. It's not as fun, but it might be able to give you the opportunity to still do the lesson in terms of really talking deeply about an issue. Yeah, not as fun though. So I hope you figure it out.
That
Ooh,
sounds like
someone had an idea in the chat box. Ooh, all these people, look at this technology I know nothing about. I'm such a dinosaur from 2016.
Adobe Spark. I teach 6th grade, and Adobe Spark is pretty idiot proof, so that they can input images and sound and voiceover and that kind of stuff.
Last questions for Abby, because I've understood you, Abby, you got to run by 2:30 your time, right?
Yep. And I have one more thing to say before we're all done, which will take 30 seconds.
Sure. Last call on questions before we give Abby the floor one more time. Do you have a list of resources that would help?
Yes, but they're all embedded in the lesson, so I don't have them like nicely done in a list. But if you want to look for resources based on a different topic, you can look inside each of the lesson topics, and there are a lot of links that will bring you to good resources like the timeline about voter suppression and stuff like that.
And I can say if anybody's looking for either, I do have election 2016, but I've been compiling election 2020 resources for a while. As anything comes across, those who've seen some of my stuff, I just drop it into my Digo account. So if anybody wants any of that before we leave, I can show you the link into that. I don't know what's in there yet. I haven't looked too closely, but if I get it, I tag it and throw it in there. So. Any last questions? Abby, it looks like the floor is yours.
Okay, I just thought I'd tell you what an example of one of the civic engagement contracts that one of my classes came up with. Because I taught, like I said, English and history, and so my classes were about 2.5 hours long, a little longer, and so I taught 2 main classes and then some interventions in between, so I had an AM and a PM class. And so in 2016, this was my afternoon classes civic engagement contract, and it was 7 rules, and they were, number 1, be curious and open-minded. Number 2, speak your mind truthfully. Number 3, think critically and explain your opinions with facts and reasoning. Number 4, listen to each other. Number 5, respect each other. Disagree with each other's ideas, not with each other as people. Number 6, be kind. Number 7, get involved. Decisions are made by those who show up. So I thought I'd leave you with that because personally I find that very meaningful, and it makes me really happy that 13-year-olds created that by themselves.
Thank you so very much, Abby. I'm waiting for someone to ask if they can get a copy of that. And yeah,
No, you have to create your own.
So I did drop in the chat box a link to what I have so far for the 2020 elections. It does update if you copy that link. Anything I add will continue to show up in there. So you do have that going. I have other things as well. Abby said that the resources are in there. Jessica, maybe if you email Abby directly, she'll be kind to send you Jessica would like a copy of that. But she also just said, have your kids make their own, right? Like whatever they come up with is going to be meaningful for them. So.
That was all from them.
Well, Abby, it was so great to see you. I know how busy your schedule is. So thank you for spending an hour sharing your passion, your time, your expertise. It's always great to catch up. Like I said, I got to work with Abby a lot in a bunch of different capacities there. She truly is a teacher leader, and I couldn't be prouder of all the work she continues to do. And the fact that she came back makes me happy, or came to Maine makes me happy.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I loved preparing for this, and it's an indication that like I miss it a little too much.
Awesome. Thank you.